In the heart of a quiet, sun-drenched valley, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, lay the village of Aldermore. Life here moved at a slow, unhurried pace. The mornings were filled with the soft clatter of wooden carts, the cries of vendors hawking fresh bread, and the gentle murmur of neighbors exchanging news from nearby farms. Among the villagers lived a young woman named Leora. At 20, she was on the cusp of womanhood, carrying the grace and innocence of youth, yet beneath her delicate exterior was a mind sharp as a finely honed blade. Leora had grown up in a modest home at the edge of Aldermore. Her family, though respectable, struggled to make ends meet. Her father, once a skilled carpenter, now spent his days in the village market crafting simple furniture, while her mother tended to their small vegetable garden and kept their humble home spotless. Leora, the eldest of 3 children, often helped with the chores, tending to her younger siblings and assisting her mother with cooking and cleaning. Though the work was exhausting, she performed it with a quiet diligence that made her beloved by those around her. Despite her simplicity, Leora possessed an unusual combination of beauty and intellect. Her hair, the color of dark chestnuts kissed by sunlight, fell in soft waves over her shoulders, framing a face marked by high cheekbones and expressive, thoughtful eyes. Her lips curved naturally into a gentle smile, one that could warm even the coldest heart. Yet it was her mind that set her apart. She loved to read the few books her village school offered, absorbing tales of distant lands and heroes who triumphed over adversity. She asked questions that often puzzled adults and offered insights far beyond her years, earning the quiet admiration of those who knew her. Still, life in Aldermore offered little opportunity for ambition. The villagers were bound by tradition, and young women were expected to marry and settle into domestic life. Yet Leora's spirit yearned for more. She dreamed of traveling beyond the hills, of seeing grand cities and meeting people who lived lives unlike the humble, repetitive rhythms of her own. She imagined a world filled with opportunity and adventure, though she knew the realities of her circumstances made such dreams distant and fragile. Her days were a delicate balance of routine and imagination. Mornings were spent fetching water from the well and tending to chores. Afternoons were filled with helping her mother in the garden or visiting neighbors with errands. But in the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Leora would retreat to a quiet corner of their modest home. There, she would read by candlelight, letting her imagination wander to worlds far beyond Aldermore. In these moments, she felt free, unshackled from the limitations of her small village, dreaming of a life that could be hers if only fate allowed it. Despite her dreams, Leora was deeply rooted in reality. She loved her family fiercely and understood the sacrifices they made daily. She had witnessed their struggles, the long hours her father spent in the workshop, the way her mother's hands were always worn from labor. This awareness tempered her desires, instilling a sense of duty alongside her curiosity for the wider world. Her heart was kind, her thoughts clear, and her spirit quietly determined, a combination that made her more remarkable than anyone in Aldermore could have realized. And so, Leora lived in a delicate tension, a young woman whose life was bound by the modesty of her surroundings, yet whose mind and heart yearned for something far greater. Unbeknownst to her, the twists of fate were already aligning, setting the stage for a life-changing encounter that would take her beyond the valley, beyond the hills, and into a world she had only dared to imagine. Life in Aldermore had always been predictable, but as Leora's 20th birthday approached, a sense of unease crept quietly into her family's home. Her father, once a man full of confidence and easy laughter, now spoke in hushed tones with her mother. Bills and debts, long buried under pride and perseverance, had begun to weigh heavily upon them. The small profits from carpentry and garden sales were no longer enough to keep the household afloat. Leora noticed the subtle tension. Her mother's hands trembled slightly as she kneaded dough, her father's eyes lingered too long on the ledger before he sighed. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as Leora helped her mother fold freshly laundered linens, that the first whispers of the arrangement reached her. A traveling merchant, whose words often carried hints of news from the larger towns and distant estates, had casually mentioned the name of a wealthy baron who sought a bride. He spoke of the man's vast fortune and power, and of the fear he inspired in all who knew him. The villagers' hushed gossip suggested that no one dared to approach him lightly, that he was a man who lived by his own rules and exacted his own justice. Yet, for families like Leora's, burdened by debt and misfortune, such rumors were not deterrents, they were opportunities, though bitterly unpalatable. Leora's parents made their decision quickly, but with a heavy heart. To refuse a proposition from a man as powerful as the Baron would mean financial ruin, perhaps even dishonor for their family. The words themselves, though spoken calmly, felt like shackles binding her future. Leora would be given to the Baron, still untouched by love or marriage, her fate determined not by her heart, but by necessity. When her father finally told her, his voice was barely above a whisper, filled with both apology and desperation. Her mother stood silently behind him, her hands tightly clasped, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For Leora, the announcement was like a jolt. She had heard the stories of the Baron, of the way he struck fear into all who crossed his path, and the thought of being handed to such a man ignited both dread and fascination. Her mind raced what kind of life awaited her. Would she be treated as a daughter-in-law, a servant, or worse, a commodity? The very idea of leaving the village she had known all her life, of entering a household steeped in wealth and mystery, filled her with both awe and terror. Yet there was no room for protest. In Eldermore, survival often demanded sacrifice, and her family's welfare outweighed her personal desires. Over the next days, preparations began quietly. Her clothes were selected and pressed, simple garments transformed into modest yet respectable attire suitable for the Baron's estate. Gifts and offerings, symbols of goodwill and submission, were prepared for the journey. Leora moved through the tasks with an outward calm, though inside her thoughts were a turbulent storm. She tried to imagine the man she would meet, yet every mental image felt incomplete, a shadow of the reality that surely awaited. Despite her fear, a small spark of determination remained. Leora refused to see herself as merely a passive victim. She resolved to maintain her dignity, her intelligence, and her sense of self, no matter what awaited her. She studied the Baron from the little she could learn through gossip, trying to anticipate his nature, seeking patterns in the tales told by travelers and merchants. She clung to the hope that even in a world dominated by wealth and power, there was a place for courage, for cleverness, and perhaps even for unexpected kindness. And so, the day of departure arrived. Eldermore, with its familiar hills, fields, and familiar faces, was left behind. Leora, a quiet village girl with dreams still untarnished, stepped into the unknown. The journey ahead was not just one of miles and roads. It was a passage into a world of wealth, influence, and danger, a world that would test every ounce of her courage and shape the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined. The carriage ride to the Baron's estate was long and fraught with a tension that pressed on Leora's chest like a heavy weight. The hills of Eldermore gradually gave way to dense forests, their shadows stretching across the road like silent sentinels. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and distant rivers. Each turn of the wheels brought her further from the village she had known, further from the comforting routine of home, and closer to a fate she could neither fully understand nor control. As the estate loomed into view, Leora's breath caught in her throat. It was a structure of immense proportions, a fortress more than a home. High stone walls encircled the grounds, topped with iron spikes that glinted ominously in the sunlight. Towers rose like watchful eyes, and the grand gates, adorned with intricate carvings of heraldic symbols, seemed to warn any intruder to keep their distance. Villagers who had accompanied her on the journey whispered nervously about the Baron, their voices barely audible over the clatter of hooves. The rumors they repeated were unsettling. Tales of vanished servants, of a Baron whose temper was legendary, whose wealth and influence were unmatched, and whose presence inspired fear in every town and village for miles. When the carriage finally came to a halt in the vast courtyard, the gates opened silently, revealing an imposing figure standing at the entrance of the manor. He was taller than most men Leora had ever seen, broad-shouldered, with a posture that radiated authority without a word. His dark eyes, sharp and calculating, seemed to pierce straight through her, and yet there was a stillness to him, a measured calm that made him appear almost untouchable. For a moment, Leora felt as if the air itself had thickened, each heartbeat louder in her chest than the last. The Baron spoke her name with a voice that was deep, even, and surprisingly smooth. He offered no smile, no gesture of comfort, only a polite nod that acknowledged her presence without revealing emotion. Leora realized quickly that this was a man who revealed very little, whose silence was as commanding as his stature. Yet, in that silence, there was an unmistakable awareness, a keen intelligence that seemed to observe every detail, the way she stood, the way her hands fidgeted, the way her eyes darted nervously around the courtyard. Though intimidating, he did not behave like the cruel tyrant the rumors suggested. There was a precision in his movements, a deliberate thoughtfulness in every action. The servants moved quickly and respectfully around him, their expressions a mixture of reverence and caution. Leora noted the subtle hierarchy, the unspoken order that governed the estate. Everything had a place, every action a purpose, and the Baron's presence dominated it all not through fear alone, but through authority that demanded attention and respect. As they entered the manor, Leora felt the full weight of the Baron's world. The halls were vast, lined with tapestries depicting battles, hunts, and landscapes of grandeur. Chandeliers of crystal sparkled above, casting a soft light on the marble floors. Each room seemed to hum with history and secrecy, echoing with stories she could only guess at. The Baron moved silently through these halls, guiding her with subtle gestures rather than commands, observing her reactions with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously scrutinized and seen. By the time they reached her chamber, a large, elegantly furnished room with heavy drapes and a view of the estate gardens, Leora's fear had begun to mingle with curiosity. The Baron's reputation had painted him as a distant, almost monstrous figure, but in these first hours she sensed layers to him that no one in the village could have imagined. He was a man shaped by power and experience, yet capable of restraint and consideration. The tension between awe, fear, and intrigue took root within her, and she realized that her life at the estate would be far more complex than the simple fears she had carried from Eldermoor. As the door closed behind him, leaving her alone in the spacious room, Leora allowed herself a moment to breathe. The silent Baron, the man no one dared approach, had already begun to shape her thoughts, her perceptions, and perhaps, unknowingly, her destiny. The game had begun, and she would have to learn quickly how to navigate a world where silence spoke louder than words, and every glance could reveal or conceal a secret. Though Leora had glimpsed the grandeur of the estate from the courtyard, the true expanse of the Baron's domain revealed itself only as she began to explore under the watchful eyes of the staff. The manor was not merely a residence, it was a small world unto itself, a labyrinth of opulence, strict order, and subtle power. Marble floors stretched endlessly, and tall ceilings were adorned with frescoes of ancient battles and royal lineages. Portraits of stern ancestors gazed down from gilded frames, their eyes following her movements as though judging her worthiness. Every corridor, every room, seemed to carry its own secrets, and Leora felt both awe and trepidation. Her journey through the manor was guided by an elderly housekeeper named Marin, whose expression was stern but not unkind. Marin explained the rules of the estate in quiet, deliberate tones, pointing out the restrictions that governed servants and visitors alike. Leora noted the subtle hierarchy among the staff. The gardeners, cooks, maids, and stable hands all performed their duties with exact precision, aware that any misstep would be observed by the Baron or reported immediately. Even within these walls, she realized, her behavior would be scrutinized. There would be no room for error, no opportunity to act impulsively, yet Leora felt an unexpected thrill at the challenge. The estate's gardens were her next revelation. Vast and meticulously kept, they stretched beyond the eye's reach, with hedges trimmed into geometric perfection and fountains that sparkled in the morning sun. The air was fragrant with blooming roses, jasmine, and lavender, and the gentle hum of bees and distant songbirds created a serene soundtrack that contrasted sharply with the manor's imposing interiors. Leora wandered the paths, allowing herself to take in the beauty, yet always mindful of the invisible boundaries marked by the Baron's presence. She quickly understood that nothing here was random. Everything was designed to convey control, power, and prestige. As she moved through the manor, she began to notice the Baron's subtle influence in every detail. His favorite spaces were maintained with extraordinary care. His personal library, a vast collection of books on history, politics, and philosophy, revealed a man who valued knowledge as much as wealth. Leora, who had spent her life yearning for stories and wisdom beyond her village, felt a flicker of kinship, as though this silent, imposing man might share some of her unspoken curiosity. Yet his distance remained, a constant reminder that admiration or alliance would have to be earned, not given freely. Meals at the manor were another world entirely. Servants moved silently, presenting elaborate dishes with impeccable timing, while the Baron observed from his seat, his eyes calm but calculating. Conversation was minimal, and Leora found herself speaking only when addressed, carefully choosing her words to reflect intelligence and respect. She noticed that the Baron listened more than he spoke, a habit that magnified the weight of each word he finally uttered. This silence, once intimidating, began to feel like a test, a measure of her composure, her wit, and perhaps her courage. As days passed, Leora also observed the subtler rhythms of life at the estate. Nights were filled with the distant sound of horses, the occasional laughter of guests in the grand halls, and the rustle of servants moving through the shadows. She learned to navigate the corridors without drawing attention, to respond appropriately to unspoken cues, and to find moments of solitude where she could breathe and reflect. Each step of her journey within the manor felt like a careful dance, balancing curiosity with caution, courage with prudence. Through it all, Leora's fascination with the Baron grew. Though she had seen little of him beyond fleeting glances and brief encounters, she sensed the layers of his personality, the restraint, the intelligence, and the quiet authority that commanded respect. She began to understand that the true challenge was not merely surviving in this world of wealth and influence, but learning to navigate its invisible rules while retaining her own sense of self. By the time the sun set over the estate, painting the gardens in gold and shadow, Leora realized that her journey had only just begun. The manor was no longer just a place. It was a crucible, a world that would test her courage, intelligence, and heart. And at the center of it all, like a silent storm waiting to unfold, stood the Baron, a man whose presence would shape her life in ways she could not yet imagine. The moment arrived with a quiet inevitability. Leora had moved through the manor with a growing sense of cautious familiarity, yet she had seen the Baron only in passing glimpses of his tall, imposing figure disappearing around corners, the echo of his measured footsteps in the halls. Now, as she entered the grand library to explore the shelves of leather-bound books, she sensed that she would meet him directly, face to face. Her heartbeat quickened, each pulse a reminder of the gravity of the encounter. The library was vast, its high ceilings adorned with intricate frescoes that depicted scenes of conquest and diplomacy. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the polished wooden floors and casting long shadows across the rows of books. Leora had wandered here several times before, drawn by a love for stories and knowledge, but never had the presence of the Baron felt so imminent. She paused at a shelf, pretending to examine a book, her hands trembling slightly despite her best effort to remain composed. Then he was there, silent, deliberate, his footsteps making no more sound than the whisper of the wind. The Baron appeared at the end of the aisle, tall and commanding, yet not menacing. His dark eyes regarded her calmly, assessing, calculating, yet there was no immediate judgment, only a quiet curiosity that seemed to probe the depths of her mind. Leora felt a shiver run down her spine. This was the man the villagers had spoken of in fearful whispers, the man no one dared approach, yet here he stood, mere feet away, observing her with a patience that was both unsettling and strangely reassuring. "Good afternoon," he said finally, his voice deep, smooth, and even. There was no flourish, no attempt at intimidation, just a simple greeting, delivered with precision. Leora swallowed, aware of the weight behind his gaze. She returned the greeting, her own voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotion inside her. For several moments, they simply looked at each other. The Baron's silence was powerful, each second stretching as though testing her composure. Leora realized that she had been bracing for confrontation, for cruelty or coldness, yet she found none. Instead, there was a quiet intensity that demanded respect and awareness. Every detail, the tilt of her head, the movement of her hands seemed to register with him, and she became acutely aware of the posture and tone she had unconsciously adopted. Breaking the silence, the Baron spoke again, not with orders, but with a question. It was simple, yet layered. "Do you understand the rules of this estate?" Leora nodded, careful to meet his gaze, and replied that she did, though she admitted she was still learning. There was no scorn in his response, only a faint, almost imperceptible nod acknowledging her honesty. In that small exchange she sensed the first crack in the barrier of fear she had built around him, an understanding that perhaps the Baron was not merely a figure to be feared, but a man whose respect could be earned. The encounter continued with subtle gestures and measured words. He guided her attention to the library's rare volumes, explaining the significance of certain texts with quiet passion. She listened intently, absorbing not only the knowledge but the careful way he shared it. There was a strange duality to him, a man of immense power, commanding fear in the outside world, yet here, in these moments, revealing glimpses of intellect and refinement that no villager could have imagined. By the time she left the library, Leora felt a complicated mix of emotions, fear, fascination, and cautious intrigue. She had faced the silent Baron and survived, not only physically but intellectually and emotionally. For the first time, she sensed that this man who inspired terror in the village was capable of depth, of patience, and perhaps, though it seemed impossible, of understanding. She had taken the first step into a world where her mind and courage mattered, where fear alone would not dictate her place. The first encounter ended quietly, without ceremony, yet it left an indelible mark on both of them. For Leora, it was the first glimpse of a man who was more than the stories whispered in fear. For the Baron, it was the first recognition of a young woman whose presence might challenge him, intrigue him, and eventually alter the course of his life in ways neither could yet foresee. Life at the Baron's estate was a world apart from Eldermoor. Every day presented new challenges, new rules, and new opportunities for Leora to prove herself. She quickly realized that survival here required more than obedience. It required observation, intelligence, and the courage to act when necessary. Each hallway she traversed, each room she entered, seemed to whisper reminders of the Baron's authority, of the invisible web of hierarchy and expectation that governed the estate. Mornings were rigorous. Leora learned to dress in the Baron's prescribed manner, to move with grace through the corridors, and to greet staff and guests in a manner that commanded respect without drawing undue attention. The servants, initially cold and distant, began to observe her, evaluating whether she belonged in their world. Some whispered words of warning about the Baron's temperament, while others offered small gestures of guidance, a quiet smile, a discreet tip about an approaching guest. Leora noted these carefully, learning to navigate the social currents that ran beneath the polished surface of the manor. One of her earliest lessons came from the Baron himself, though it was delivered without fanfare. He asked her to join him in the library for an afternoon, not as a servant, not as a bride, but as a student of sorts. There, he revealed a side of himself the villagers could not have imagined, a man of intellect and curiosity, who valued knowledge and integrity above wealth and appearances. He spoke of diplomacy, of history, of the intricacies of managing vast estates and delicate alliances. Leora listened, absorbing every word, her mind racing to keep pace with his insights. She realized that the Baron was testing her not for obedience, but for comprehension, for the ability to think independently and act with discernment. As days passed, Leora began to explore the estate beyond its halls. The gardens became her sanctuary, a place where she could breathe freely while observing the rhythms of life she had never known. She noticed the precise way the staff coordinated their duties, the unspoken respect they had for the Baron, and the way his influence permeated every aspect of the estate. Yet she also discovered small acts of kindness. Marin secretly leaving fresh bread in her room, the gardener offering her herbs for her meals, the stable hand providing a brief explanation of horse care when she expressed curiosity. These glimpses of warmth reminded her that even in a world dominated by power, compassion had a place. It was during these early days that Leora uncovered one of the Baron's most guarded secrets. He valued character above all else. The rumors of cruelty and tyranny, she realized, were exaggerated tales born from fear and misunderstanding. The Baron tested those around him, yes, but he also rewarded intelligence, honesty, and bravery. This realization gave Leora a sense of purpose. She was not merely a passive participant in her fate, but a player in a delicate game where choices, actions, and decisions carried real weight. However, life at the estate was not without its tensions. Some staff members were wary of her presence, suspicious of her motives, or fearful of upsetting the Baron. Others underestimated her, assuming her beauty and youth meant she lacked substance. Leora learned quickly to balance humility with confidence, to assert herself when necessary, and to retreat gracefully when discretion served her better. Each interaction became a lesson, each observation a strategy for survival and influence. By the end of her first month, Leora had begun to carve a place for herself. She was no longer the timid village girl who had arrived in fear and uncertainty. She moved with awareness, spoke with measured thought, and observed with keen eyes. The Baron's presence, once terrifying, had become a compass, guiding her understanding of power, respect, and subtlety. Life at the estate was demanding, but it also offered an unexpected truth. In a world where wealth and authority reigned, courage, intelligence, and integrity could shape destiny in ways even the Baron himself might not anticipate. Leora realized that she was no longer merely surviving, she was learning, adapting, and beginning to thrive in a world that had once seemed impossible to navigate. And with each passing day, the silent Baron, enigmatic and powerful, became not just a figure of fear, but a teacher, a challenge, and perhaps, in time, something far more profound. As weeks turned into months, Leora's initial fear of the Baron gradually transformed into cautious respect, and then into a more profound sense of trust. The silent, imposing figure who had once seemed untouchable began to reveal glimpses of humanity, not through grand gestures or words, but through subtle actions and consistent behavior. Leora realized that the Baron's strength lay not only in his wealth and authority, but in the clarity with which he understood people, how he could measure character in a glance, assess intentions with a single question, and act decisively without unnecessary cruelty. Their interactions became more frequent, though never casual. The Baron spoke little of himself, yet his questions, careful and pointed, encouraged Leora to think critically. He asked about her thoughts on history, her perspective on managing difficult situations, and even her views on justice and morality. Leora, who had spent her life observing and learning, found herself challenged in ways she had never expected. She realized that these conversations were not tests in the traditional sense, but invitations to engage, to demonstrate her intellect and courage, and to prove that she was more than a quiet village girl. One afternoon, the Baron invited her to walk with him through the gardens. The estate, bathed in the golden light of early evening, seemed almost ethereal. The fountains glistened, birds sang in the hedges, and the scent of blooming roses filled the air. He spoke of the estate's history, of the challenges he had faced in maintaining order and protecting his family's legacy. For the first time, he shared a fragment of his personal philosophy, that strength without empathy was hollow, and that power was meaningless without responsibility. Leora listened intently, realizing that behind the stern exterior was a man who had been shaped by hardship, loss, and a keen sense of duty. Trust was not built overnight. There were moments of tension when Leora's courage or curiosity challenged the Baron's expectations. Yet, each time, he responded not with anger, but with measured guidance. Once, when she questioned a strict rule regarding the servants, he explained the reasoning behind it, revealing that discipline was not arbitrary but necessary to maintain balance in a household as vast as his. Leora, though initially frustrated, came to understand the wisdom in his approach. The Baron's patience and clarity fostered a bond built on respect rather than fear, a foundation that would grow stronger with each shared experience. Leora also began to notice the subtler signs of trust he placed in her. He would allow her small freedoms, exploring parts of the estate on her own, making minor decisions regarding household matters, or speaking openly during meals. In these moments, Leora felt the weight of responsibility, but also a sense of empowerment she had never known. The Baron's trust was not given lightly, and she knew that earning it required not only intelligence but integrity, courage, and discretion. Beyond the practical lessons, there were moments of quiet human connection. The Baron's rare smiles, the faint relaxation in his posture when she demonstrated understanding, and his willingness to include her in conversations with guests, all signaled an unspoken acknowledgement of her presence and value. Leora, in turn, found herself caring not only about her own place in the estate, but about the well-being of the Baron, the staff, and the delicate balance of life within the manor. By the end of this period, fear had transformed into cautious admiration, and admiration into trust. Leora understood that the Baron, though silent and imposing, was capable of recognition, respect, and even loyalty. She had begun to see him not as an untouchable figure to be feared, but as a man who valued courage, wisdom, and integrity, qualities she possessed and was learning to wield with confidence. In this growing trust lay the promise of a connection far deeper than either had anticipated, one that could alter not only their perceptions of each other but the course of their lives. Life at the estate, for all its routines and lessons, was never entirely predictable. Beneath the polished surfaces, the orderly gardens, and the quiet authority of the Baron, there were undercurrents of envy, greed, and ambition. Leora soon learned that the world beyond the manor's walls could reach inside, bringing with it danger and intrigue. One afternoon, as she walked along the estate's eastern boundary, she noticed a group of strangers lingering near the tree line. Their clothing and demeanor suggested travelers, but their eyes darted suspiciously toward the manor, calculating, watchful. A cold sense of foreboding settled over her. Leora reported her observation to Marin, the elderly housekeeper, who confirmed her fears. A rival noble, envious of the Baron's wealth and influence, had learned of the estate's vulnerabilities and sought to exploit them. Rumors of spies, thieves, and saboteurs had long circulated in the surrounding villages, but few had ever dared to act on them. Now, however, it seemed that danger had arrived at their doorstep. The Baron, informed of the situation, remained calm. His usual silence and measured demeanor returned, but his eyes were sharper, scanning every detail, analyzing every possible threat. Leora watched him and felt a mixture of awe and apprehension. She understood that their safety rested not only on strength but on foresight and intelligence. The Baron instructed Leora to remain within the manor, yet her sense of responsibility would not allow her to stay idle. She quietly observed the strangers' movements from the edge of the gardens, noting patterns and inconsistencies that suggested their intentions were more than mere curiosity. Leora realized that her keen observation skills and knowledge of the estate could make a difference. With careful planning, she devised a way to alert the staff and guard the manor without revealing herself to the intruders. It was a delicate balance. One misstep could compromise the safety of everyone inside. When the threat escalated, a small group of intruders attempting to infiltrate the grounds, Leora took decisive action. She guided the servants to secure entrances, quietly relayed crucial information about the intruders' movements, and even created minor distractions that delayed the would-be attackers. Her courage, intelligence, and quick thinking were instrumental in preventing a potentially disastrous breach. Though the intruders eventually retreated, Leora's role in protecting the estate did not go unnoticed. The Baron, who had observed her actions with a discerning eye, approached her later that evening. For the first time, a hint of admiration softened his usually stoic expression. He spoke carefully, acknowledging not only her bravery but also the wisdom and composure she had shown under pressure. "You have a keen mind," he said quietly, "and courage that goes beyond what most would expect." Leora felt a surge of pride, tempered by the knowledge that her actions had saved more than property. They had preserved the safety of the people she had come to care for. This incident transformed Leora's place in the estate. The staff, once cautious and reserved around her, now treated her with a newfound respect, recognizing her as someone capable of contributing meaningfully to the well-being of the household. Even the Baron, silent and commanding as ever, had begun to see her as more than a visitor or ward. She was an ally, someone whose intelligence and bravery complemented his own strategic mind. Yet the hidden danger served as a reminder that the world beyond the manor walls was neither simple nor forgiving. Leora realized that courage alone was not enough. Wisdom, observation, and careful judgment were essential to survive and thrive in a world where threats could appear unexpectedly. And in facing this peril, she discovered a strength within herself she had never fully acknowledged, the ability to act decisively, to protect those she cared about, and to stand unafraid even when the outcome was uncertain. By the end of the day, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and the manor's towers cast long shadows across the gardens, Leora felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had confronted danger, earned the Baron's respect, and discovered that her presence at the estate was not merely tolerated, it was valued. And in that realization lay a promise of growth, trust, and a partnership that neither she nor the Baron had fully anticipated. The events of the hidden danger had left a lasting impression on Leora. She now understood that life at the estate was far more complex than she had ever imagined. Wealth, authority, and fear were only part of the equation. True power lay in discernment, loyalty, and the courage to act when it mattered most. Yet as much as she had learned about the Baron and his world, one question continued to haunt her. What did he truly want from her? Late one evening, as the manor settled into quiet, Leora found herself alone in the library, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows across the shelves. The Baron appeared without announcement, his presence calm but commanding. He did not speak immediately, allowing her the space to gather her thoughts, to reflect on the months she had spent navigating this new life. Then, finally, he addressed the question that had been unspoken but ever present, her role in the estate and her place in his life. "I have observed you closely," he began, his deep voice measured yet gentle. "You have courage, intelligence, and a strength of character that is rare. You have acted without prompting, protected this household, and proven yourself more capable than most would dare expect. You did not come here simply to be a guest or a ward. You came here to shape your own path, and in doing so, you have proven your worth." Leora listened, her heart racing. For the first time, she realized that the rumors surrounding the Baron's intentions had been false. The stories of cruelty and indifference were exaggerated, fueled by fear and misunderstanding. He had never intended to harm her, to control her mind or her spirit. Instead, he had sought someone capable of navigating the complexities of his world with intelligence, courage, and integrity qualities she possessed. "You have a choice," he continued. "You may remain here, learning, growing, and shaping your own destiny, or you may leave and pursue whatever life you wish. Nothing I have asked of you has been meant to bind you, only to reveal what you are capable of achieving." His words were deliberate, each syllable carrying weight and sincerity. For the first time since her journey began, Leora felt a sense of clarity. She had come to the estate with fear, uncertainty, and the weight of her family's expectations pressing upon her. Yet now she realized that her fate was not dictated by wealth, authority, or obligation. She had the power to choose her own path, to assert her agency in a world that had once seemed unyielding. As she considered her options, memories of the months at the manor flooded her mind, the quiet lessons, the subtle tests, the moments of human connection, and the danger she had helped avert. She saw the Baron not as a figure of fear, but as a man who valued strength, intelligence, and courage. She recognized that the trust he had placed in her, though earned, was also a reflection of her own capacity to act wisely and decisively. In that moment, Leora made her choice. She would remain at the estate, not out of obligation or fear, but because she saw an opportunity to shape her destiny alongside someone who respected her mind and spirit. She would step into a life that challenged her, tested her, and rewarded her for her courage and intelligence. And she would do so fully aware that the journey ahead would demand resilience, wit, and unwavering determination. The Baron observed her as she spoke her decision, his eyes revealing a rare flicker of approval. "Then we move forward together," he said simply. It was not a declaration of possession or dominance, but of partnership, a recognition that the path ahead would be navigated by mutual respect, shared courage, and a growing understanding of one another. In choosing to stay, Leora had embraced not only her own potential, but the possibility of an extraordinary life won in which her decisions, her courage, and her intellect would shape not only her destiny, but the very course of the Baron's world. And in that revelation, she understood the profound truth. The future was hers to shape, and she would do so on her own terms. The seasons had changed since Leora first arrived at the Baron's estate, and with them, so had she. The timid village girl who had stepped cautiously over the manor's threshold was now a woman of quiet confidence, intelligence, and courage. She had learned the rhythms of the estate, navigated its hidden dangers, and earned the respect of the staff and the trust of the Baron. What had once seemed an insurmountable world had become a place where her talents, insight, and heart mattered. The Baron, too, had changed not in the fundamentals of his nature, which remained disciplined and commanding, but in the way he interacted with the world. Where he had once been distant and inscrutable, he now displayed subtle warmth and attentiveness toward Leora. His respect for her was evident in the smallest of gestures: a slight nod when she made an insightful observation, a quiet conversation in the gardens about philosophy or strategy, the rare but meaningful smile that seemed reserved only for her. In these moments, Leora realized that fear and awe had transformed into mutual admiration, and admiration into something deeper, more profound. One afternoon, as they walked through the gardens during the golden light of late afternoon, the Baron stopped by a fountain and regarded Leora thoughtfully. "You have changed this estate," he said softly. "Not merely in the decisions you've made or the courage you've shown, but in the very atmosphere here. You have brought balance, intelligence, and life where it was absent." His words were neither grandiose nor performative. They were sincere, carrying a weight that reached into her heart. Leora felt a flush of warmth, a recognition that her presence mattered in a world where she had once been nothing more than a newcomer. The villagers of Eldermoor, who had once whispered rumors of the Baron's cruelty and the girl's fate, were stunned when news of Leora's flourishing life at the manor began to spread. They had expected fear, oppression, or subservience, but instead they heard of her courage, her wisdom, and the Baron's growing admiration for her. The whispers turned to awe and, in some cases, envy. The girl they had thought powerless had become a woman who shaped her own destiny, commanding respect in a realm that had once intimidated even the bravest of men. Over time, the bond between Leora and the Baron deepened. It was not a bond forged from passion or romance alone, but from respect, understanding, and shared experience. They discovered in each other a partnership that transcended fear and obligation, a recognition of intellect, courage, and integrity. Where others saw only wealth and power, they saw shared vision and companionship. The Baron, who had inspired dread for so long, became a protector, confidant, and ally. And Leora, who had once feared the unknown, became a guiding presence, respected for her insight and valued for her unwavering resolve. In the quiet of the manor at night, as the moonlight spilled across the gardens and the distant hills shimmered in silver, Leora reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had been given to a man feared by all, yet through courage, intelligence, and integrity, she had transformed fear into respect, uncertainty into agency, and isolation into connection. Her life had become a testament to the power of choice, the strength of character, and the unexpected rewards of bravery. And so, in a world that had expected her to be silent, obedient, and powerless, Leora had created a life that surprised everyone, even the Baron himself. She was no longer merely the girl from Eldermoor. She was a woman of influence, wisdom, and compassion. And as the Baron walked beside her, silent yet attentive, she understood that happiness was not merely a gift, but something she had earned through courage, patience, and the audacity to shape her own destiny. The village, the staff, and even those who had doubted her all witnessed the transformation. What had seemed impossible, trust, respect, partnership, and true happiness had become reality. Leora had stepped into a life of her own design, and in doing so, she had shocked the world that had underestimated her. The girl who had once been given to a man no one dared approach had, against all odds, created a life that was richer, braver, and more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined.